Okay, I'm gonna try this. Basically, wanted to first introduce you to Harrow Strait. This is between San Juan Island and Vancouver Island, the Pacific Northwest of U.S. and Canada. And there's about 5,000 bulk, big deep seas, we call them, vessels, ships, going back and forth in commerce between this region and Asia, carrying raw materials out, logs, coal, petroleum, and bringing in products, cars, TVs, refrigerators, and stuff like that. Anyway, it's a very busy shipping lane. Actually, it's probably 8,000 a year now. I don't know, 5,000 a year was a 1989 figure. And as we see right now at this moment, well, you can't see over there, but 1, 2, 3, 4 deep seas in the course of, maybe a half hour going past this location in Harrow Strait. This is also the foraging pathway for the southern resident killer whales. I began the study of this population of killer whales in 1976 at the behest of the National Marine Fisheries Service that needed to know how many individual whales were in this population. And in 76, there were approximately 70. We found that from photo identification of each individual. That research program really began in Canada with Dr. Mike Bigg, who photographed whales all the way from Johnstone Strait, northern BC, to Victoria, southern BC. And these pods that he had down in this area, in the so-called southern community, were he named, alphanumerically designated them J, K, and L pod. So we'd have within a pod or a group, an association that he photographed in detail, everybody that was there. He'd start with the first identifiable animal, for example, J1. And then he'd go to the next one, call it J2, and then J3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so on, up until about 14 that he had by 1975. In 1976, when we began the study, there was one new baby in that J-pod, and we called it J15. And the following year, there was J16. And so on. As babies were born, we added them to the alphanumeric grouping of that pod. We didn't really know that much about the social dynamics or the demographics of the population at the time, but saw early on that if we could identify every individual for every year, we could see how long it took individuals to grow up, and then when they started having babies, and how often they had babies, and then how long they lived, and who they hung out with. It was a perfect opportunity to look at a complete population of a large predator animal, killer whale, in a detail that was unprecedented, really. Been done with chimpanzees and elephants and lions and stuff in Africa. But again, there was not a complete coverage of the population in most cases. Here we had everybody. It's like having an aquarium full of fish that you can count every one and see when they're having babies and so on. Anyway, we began that in 1976, and now it's the year 2015. It's our 40th year of this photo identification, comprehensive identification of every individual. And we have found that it takes at least 10 years for female juvenile offspring to mature and start having babies of its own. Most of them don't have their own babies until their teens, early teens, even late teens. They may have lost some in the process, like some aborts or neonatal fatalities, but in general, early teens is about when we start seeing them have viable babies. And they produce babies until they're in their early 40s. This we started documenting from known age whales now. The male babies stay with the mother, and they mature in their teens, and they are fathering offspring in their 20s. And the older ones seem to father more offspring than the younger ones. Our population is now 81 whales as of April 2015. In the late 80s, early 90s, it reached almost 100 individuals. We had a growth curve after 1976 with a little dip in the mid-80s. But they basically recovered from the capture eras that had gone on in the 60s and 70s. And then they started to decline. And in 2005, the U.S. government declared them endangered under the Endangered Species Act. Canada had just prior listed them under the Species at Risk Act in Canada as endangered. And money began to flow to promote their recovery, including research on these animals. We had been doing the research for 30-some years, basically with public support and a lot of tenacity, just being here and taking pictures and working in the winter somewhere else. The primary occupancy time for the southern residents in this Harrow Strait area is May through September. And that's when we have most of our runs of salmon returning to the rivers in Canada, largely in the Fraser River, but also Nooksack and Skagit in the U.S., and some Puget Sound stocks are also food supply. But then these fish are only returning to the rivers to spawn during certain brief periods of time. One stock to the Fraser may, like early summer, king salmon will return to spawn in the early summer. They return to the river. Some of them are midsummer stocks, and some of them are autumn or fall stocks. And same with all the river systems in the eastern North Pacific. There are a total of about, before dams and so on, and before commercial fishing and recreational fishing, there are probably 12 to 15, maybe 20 million adult Chinook salmon returning to the Pacific Northwest each year. That would be a year group that would return and spawn in the rivers. And as you know, in salmon life cycle, after spawning, they die. And then the nutrients from their carcasses are distributed throughout the ecosystem, not only in the forests that the eagles and bears take carcasses up and eat them up in a tree and so on. The nitrogen that was in that fish is the nitrogen that's in that forest. And the nutrients that are in that ecosystem were brought here from the ocean by the fish. And then the young fish, when they hatch from the eggs, come downriver and they smoltify or adapt to saltwater as they enter the estuary area at the river mouth. And then they go out to sea for 4 or 5 years and mature and return and lay eggs upriver and so on. Anyway, there are probably, at least 12, perhaps upward of 20 to 40 million of these fish returning to the ecosystems of the eastern North Pacific annually in this repeating life cycle of Chinook or king salmon. There are also other salmon species, sockeye, pink, chum, and who's the other one? Silver, coho, that were also returning to these rivers. But they have life cycles of 2 years or 3 years or so on, and coho 3 or 4 years, the silver is returning. The Chinook were the big ones. They grow up to 100 pounds, or even more. In the case of the Yellow River, I think they had some 120 pounders. And some of the hogs they call them in the Columbia River system were over 100 pounds. Anyway, it's a huge biomass returning every year. And this predator population evolved to feed upon that biomass. It was basically available year-round. Even though they returned to the rivers to spawn, the feeding schools also were up and down the coast, largely in the continental shelf waters, but some out on the high seas, feeding on smaller fishes and invertebrates that were in the ecosystem at sea. Anyway, these predators, the southern resident killer whales that we were studying, over time became obligate predators on the Chinook salmon. They would eat the other species, but their survival depended on having a year-round supply of fish, and Chinook was it. That supply of fish was seriously reduced with the advent of Europeans in the fishing industry and canneries and so on. They were set up on every river system, and huge numbers of these fish were harvested for humans. And this has continued to this day. There's also a very large recreational fishery. In Puget Sound alone, in 1976, the commercial fishery was 250,000 Chinook salmon per year, and the recreational fishery was 250,000. So about 500,000 Chinook were taken out by humans, not to mention the whales that were coming through twice a month eating whatever salmon stocks were heading to the Puget Sound rivers, or feeding in the Puget Sound ecosystem. And likewise in the Georgia Basin ecosystem, there are probably 1 million fish removed for human use, recreational and commercial, and the whales also spent several days a month feeding in those areas. And then they would go out to the open ocean where the fish were coming in and find mixed stocks out there that were from other ecosystems in the Pacific Northwest, including the Columbia River, which was probably the biggest source of Chinook salmon in the early years. When humans built dams on the rivers and didn't allow for the passage of fish to go upriver to spawn, we severely restricted the population of Chinook salmon that were available for the prey supplies for these whales. So that just automatically reduced the carrying capacity of the eastern North Pacific for resident or fish-eating killer whales. And that's still going on, although there's now dam removal has occurred in the Elwha system on the Olympic Peninsula, being proposed for the Klamath system in northern California, also being proposed for the Snake River system, a tributary of the Columbia in Idaho and eastern Washington. Removal of these dams that obstructed fish passage is a high priority to restore the salmon. And these will be wild salmon that are restored, not hatchery fish. And so therefore the annual cost of maintaining hatcheries and jobs and so on won't be incurred, it'll just be removal of the obstacles. Until that happens, and carrying capacity is increased in the eastern North Pacific, we're just simply not going to have a recovery of southern resident fish-eating killer whales to anything like historic or prehistoric levels unless we do something about the obstacles to fish reproduction. And hatcheries are not the answer. Fish farms obviously are not, because they're all in a pen and not really available to the whales. The hatcheries dilute the wild salmon stocks. If you let out 500,000 smolts from a hatchery, and you have 5,000 wild smolts also coming out into the ocean ecosystem, the hatchery production far exceeds the natural production, and they're competing for the resources. Even though the hatchery fish may not have as good a viability, they're still eating the food that would have been available for the wild fish. And then when they return to the ecosystem, the harvest for humans is based upon the expected return, largely of hatchery fish. And so the wild fish get caught in the harvest too. So it's just an ever-dwindling spiral here of hatcheries diluting and destroying wild stocks further from what had been decimation, really, from dams and over-harvest in the past. And then you have pollution, and you have all that shipping. We face a lot of issues. So I'm going to end that there and come back later.